1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, hello.
Welcome to another episode of Serious Rock Talk. I'm one of your co-hosts and co-creators, Ferris Kennedy, and now I'll pass it on to the other co-host and co-creator, Dr. Ian Clarke.
Thank you very much, my friend. Serious Rock Talk Crime. That's a little title we can roll with. Occasionally do that. Most recently we did one covering the Beach Boys' involvement with Charles Manson. And we thank you for your kind responses for that episode. Today we're looking at a very influential figure in rock and roll history. We're taking a look at Brian Jones, the founder of the Rolling Stones. Remember, no Brian Jones, no Rolling Stones. Very easy equation, and that alone makes him extremely important. And what we're going to discuss is how he died. The circumstances. Was it murder, misfortune, or misadventure? Stay with us, and you decide. To make sense of the life of Brian Jones, you really have to start at the beginning because there are clues. And I will mention them as we go along that are consistently pro-offered in a kind of Sherlockian way, making the resolution more understandable, if not, sadly, inevitable. Let us begin at the beginning. Brian Jones, 1942 to 1969, among the first members of the infamous 27 Club. He was born in Shetland, England, and died in Hartsfield, England. An attack of croup at the age of 4 left Jones with asthma that lasted for the rest of his life. First clue there, let's remember that when we come to discuss his death. He had a stable upbringing with middle-class parents. He had 2 sisters. Jones attended local schools. He did well in exams despite a lack of academic effort. Another clue, very smart, but low on discipline. Let's remember that. He found school regimented and disliked school uniforms and conformism in general. His hostility to authority figures resulted in his suspension from school on 2 occasions. According to a childhood friend, quote, he was the rebel without a cause, but when examinations came, he was brilliant, unquote. Both Jones's parents were interested in music. Another clue, his father was a piano teacher in addition to his job as an aeronautical engineer. And his mother played piano and organ and led the choir at the local church. Jones listened to classical music as a child but preferred blues, particularly Elmore James and Robert Johnson. In 1957, he first heard Cannonball Adderley's music and took an interest in jazz. Jones persuaded his parents to buy him a saxophone. The trivia here, Brian Jones played sax on a Beatles recording. Can you guess which one? Well, I'll tell you at the end. Back to it. 2 years later, his parents gave him his first guitar, acoustic, and he began performing in local blues and jazz clubs while busking and working steadily. He reportedly stole small amounts of money from work to pay for cigarettes, and he was fired. Another clue. Bad with money, and we'll see how that affected his life. All right, Brian Jones became a father early on. Over the course of his brief life, he had a lot of children. You would be hard-pressed to say that he was a good father. That certainly was not in his blood. But what we're trying to do now is establish character and in turn question certain aspects of his demise. Who was he? One way to look at it, one way to look at character, is to study relationships. So here we go. Jones's first child was born in 1958. The baby, of course, was given up for adoption. You'll see this pattern in Jones' life. In December 1959, Jones's girlfriend, a Cheltenham girl named Valerie Corbett, became pregnant. Although it's purportedly encouraged her to have an abortion, she carried the child to term. Giving birth in May of 1960, she placed the baby up for adoption. In November 1959, Jones went to the Wooden Bridge Hotel in Guildford to see a band perform. He met a young married woman there named Angeline. The two had a one-night stand that resulted in her pregnancy. Angeline and her husband decided to raise the baby. Jones never knew about the pregnancy. In 1961, Jones applied for a scholarship to Cheltenham Art College. He was initially accepted, but the offer was withdrawn 2 days later after identified acquaintance wrote to the college calling Jones, quote, an irresponsible drifter, end quote. Later that year, Jones's girlfriend, Pat Andrews, gave birth to his fourth known child. Jones moved in with them and sold his record collection to buy flowers for Andrews and clothes for the newborn. In a television interview, Andrews stated that in the early days of the relationship, although she and Jones were both working, his interest in the guitar meant he did not have much money for buying food or anything, such as paying for the rent. According to Andrews, Jones was initially proud of his son, but when the Rolling Stones acquired a manager, Andrew Luke Oldham, Jones was instructed not to be seen with either mother or child. Jones agreed, she said, telling her she would have to, quote, put up with it for a few months, unquote, until the band had some success. As a sidebar, John Lennon was told the same thing by Brian Epstein. He was married. Keep the marriage in the background. However, once the Stones became successful, she noted Jones, quote, just seemed to drift away, unquote. In 1963, Jones began a relationship with Linda Lawrence. In July of 1964, Lawrence gave birth to Jones's fifth child. Lawrence married Scottish pop singer Donovan, and they raised Julian together. He changed his name to Julian Leach. In October 1964, Jones's occasional girlfriend, Dawn Malloy, announced to Jones that the Rolling Stones management, that she was pregnant by him. She received a check for £700 from the group's manager. In return, she signed an agreement that the matter was closed, and she would make no further claims on Jones. Undated statement was signed by Malloy and witnessed by a Mr. Mick Jagger. Malloy eventually gave the boy up for adoption. In 1965, he met the German singer Nico and began a 3-month relationship with her. Jones introduced her to Andy Warhol and recommended she show him her music. So she did, and that's how she got her role with the Velvet Underground. She became pregnant during the affair, but they decided to have an abortion in London later that same year. A year later, while on tour, he met an Italian-German model and actress, Anita Pallenberg, backstage, and began a significant relationship with her. He became abusive toward her. At one point, he broke his hand on her face. In 1967, Pallenberg left him for bandmate Keith Richards, which added tension to the whole situation with the Rolling Stones, another clue to remember. Jones had a subsequent relationship with an English model, Suki Portier, and Swedish model Anna Wolin, as well as a short relationship in 1968 with American model Danielle Luna, the great Danielle Luna, who appeared with him in the concert film The Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus several months before his death. Now, Suki Portier, the trivia on that was she was in the car driven by a guy named Tara Brown. 1967. Tara Brown was an heir to the Guinness fortune. He was only 21 years old, and the car was in an accident in the early morning hours in London. And John Lennon read about it the next day and got a notebook out and wrote, I read the news today, oh boy, what a lucky man who made the grade. Wolin was living with Jones in 1969 when he died and has written 2 books about her time with him. She stated that during the last years, Jones had expressed immense guilt over not being there for his children. So we should accommodate that. Jones' youngest child is a daughter named Barbara Ann Marlin, born in 1969 to American woman. She raised the girl with her husband. So 6 children by 6 different women in 10 years. Okay, let's go back a few years. Jones left Cheltenham and moved to London, where he became a blues musician. For a short time, he called himself Elmo Lewis. He placed an ad in 1962, May, in Jazz News, looking for people to start a band. The first person to respond was pianist Ian Stewart. Later, singer Mick Jagger joined the band. Jagger brought his childhood friend with him, Keith Richards, and that's the nucleus of the Rolling Stones. As Richards tells it, Jones, quote, came up with the name Rolling Stones, no G, by looking at a Muddy Waters album. The album was called The Best of Muddy Waters. It was lying on the floor when Brian was talking to a promoter, and the promoter wanted a name. Brian said, the Rolling Stones, unquote. They played their first gig July the 12th, 1962 at the Marquee Club. From September 62 to September 63, Jones, Jagger, and Richards shared a flat. So they were buddies, and they got really good on the guitars, especially Jones and Richards. And Jones taught Mick Jagger how to play the harmonica. He was a multi-instrumentalist, something I'll get to later. So the four Stones were looking for a bass player. They came across Bill Wyman. They liked him because he owned his own bass. In fact, he made his own guitar, and he had an amplifier. He'd been in the Army in the reserves. He had a bit of money. And they finally got Charlie Watts to join in 63. So the lineup was in place. Watts said of Jones in the early days, quote, Brian was very instrumental in pushing the band at the beginning. Keith and I would look at him and say he was barmy. It was a crusade to him to get us on stage in the club and be paid half a crown and to be billed as an R&B band, unquote. While acting as the band's manager, Jones received, somewhat secretly, an extra £5 that the others didn't get. When they found out, they were really mad about it. Jones has a problem with money. He has a problem with insecurity, and it becomes full-blown later on. Often it seemed found it difficult to appraise his impact on those around him. Look at his terrible, irresponsible record as a father. Look at the way he handles money and friendships. He had blind spots. Later on, he would self-medicate. He was the most naturally gifted of any of the Rolling Stones. Multi-instrumentalist, proficient at a wide variety of stuff. You can hear him on Aftermath in 66, Between the Buttons in 67, Satanic Majesty's Request in 67 too. He added the following exotic instruments to the Stones songs like the marimba on Under My Thumb, the sitar on Painted Black, the recorder on Ruby Tuesday, which I think makes that song, the mellotron on She's a Rainbow, the saxophone on Dandelion, and the Appalachian dulcimer on Lady Jane, which I think makes that track. Once it became evident Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were great songwriters, Brian Jones was left standing in the shadows. If it was left up to Brian, the Stones would just be playing the blues. That's what he loved. It's hard to pin down a date when Brian Jones kind of advocated rather his leadership, but I say it's probably around 64, 65. He was a smart guy, and he could see the writing on the wall. They were a pop band. They weren't a blues band. His relationship with their manager, Andrew Luke Oldham, also deteriorated. Andrew Luke Oldham was uncomfortable with him and treated him that way. In March of 67, Anita Pallenberg, Jones' girlfriend of 2 years, left him for Keith Richards. The three had gone to Morocco together. Jones got sick. He had fragile health. And she shacked up with the Richards. So if the guy wasn't insecure before, that didn't help him. He was arrested for drug possession in May in 67. He said it wasn't his, that it was a friend's or what have you. But that just added to his paranoia. Hostility grew between Jagger and Richards and Jones, further alienated him from the group. And he became very strange. Bill Wyman observed, quote, there are at least two sides to Brian's personality. One, Brian was introverted, shy, sensitive, deep thinking. The other was a preening peacock, gregarious, artistic, desperately needing assurance from his peers. He pushed every friendship to the limit and way beyond. Charlie Watts said kind of the same thing. He said drugs and drinking, quote, weren't good for Brian. He wasn't strong mentally or physically to take any of it. Brian was one of those people who did everything to excess, unquote. Mick Jagger said just a few years ago that Brian didn't know how to handle fame, and when it came, it just blew him over. Bill Wyman said, quote, Brian formed the band. He chose the members. He named the band. He chose the music we played. He was very influential, very important, and then he slowly lost it. Highly intelligent, but just kind of wasted it and blew it all away, unquote. His last substantial session with the Stones occurred in spring and summer of 1968 when they produced Jumpin' Jack Flash and Beggar's Banquet. And he's in the Jean-Luc Godard film, I think it's called 1+1. He was arrested in May of 68 for cannabis possession. And he was going to go to jail, the judge let him off. And so his legal troubles estranged him from the band because they wanted to tour and Jones couldn't get a U.S. visa. That didn't help. And he wouldn't turn up for recording sessions, and if he did, he was too stoned to play. So Jagger informed Jones that he would be fired from the band if he didn't turn up for a photo session in May of 1969. Incredibly, he did show up. In June of 69, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts visited him at his house and told him he was out of the band. They had to start touring, and he was replaced by 20-year-old Mick Taylor. Keith Richards remembers, quote, "The man was failing. He had been a strong man, but he was wiping himself out." Brian demanded. You have to understand, demanded. And in a band like this, you have to be supportive and giving. Having to deal with his jealousy, Mick and me were writing the songs. When you're working 300 days a year, it's intolerable, and you can get really nasty about it. I tried to be fair to Brian, but to be honest, he was a bit of a bastard, and it doesn't surprise me that he came to a sticky end. When Jagger was asked about it in 1995, he said he didn't feel guilty about Brian's death. Quote, "I don't really. I do feel that I behaved in a childish way, but we were very young, and in some ways we picked on him. But unfortunately, he made himself a target. He was very, very jealous, very difficult, very manipulative. And if you do that in this kind of group of people, they get you back, to be honest," unquote. During this period of his decreasing involvement in the band, he was living at Cotsford Farm in East Essex, and he purchased it in 1968. And he was talking about getting a new band together. Around midnight on July 23rd, 1969, he was discovered motionless at the bottom of his swimming pool. His girlfriend, Anna Wolin, was convinced he was alive when he was taken out of the pool, insisting he still had a pulse. However, by the time the doctors arrived, it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival, dead at the age of 27. The coroner's report stated it was a drowning. They later changed this to death by misadventure and noted his liver and heart were greatly enlarged by drug and alcohol abuse. And the coroner's report also ruled drowning under the influence of drink and drugs. Okay, now we get to the weirdness of Brian Jones' death. The night he died, he held a small party at his house with copious amounts of alcohol and cakes baked with hash. A construction worker, Frank Thorogood, remember that name, who had been living at the musician's home and doing some renovations on the property, was allegedly in a financial dispute with Jones on the day he died. Along with Thorogood, police reports state there were 3 other people there that night. The guitarist's girlfriend, Anna Wolin, I've mentioned her, manager and former chauffeur, Tom Clarke, and Clarke's girlfriend, Janet Lawson. Clarke initially claimed he wasn't there and later changed his mind. Kind of a weird situation, a weird clue. Thorogood helped Wolin pull Jones' body out of the water. She later claimed sensationally that Jones was killed in a scuffle with a disgruntled Thorogood, said to have been fired by Jones earlier that day. So this is when it gets really hazy, folks. She claims that Thorogood pushed Jones' head underwater. She doesn't know if it was just fooling around or what was going on, or if he was being aggressive. Tom Clarke claims that Brian's death was caused by Thorogood. He stated that Frank felt he was underpaid and underappreciated, although Jones had already paid him £18,000 for his work on the farm, and this is 1969. After an angry Jones realized he couldn't squeeze more money from his employer, he allegedly jammed Jones' head in a trough on the property filled with water and then moved his lifeless body into the pool. Clarke stated, quote, "In 1993, I went to see Frank in the hospital. He was dying, and he said, 'It was me that done Brian in.' I said, 'I'll come back tomorrow and you can tell me more.' But he died that night. I never found out the specifics," unquote. Clarke later denied that Thorogood confessed. Deathbed confessions are always tricky, but intriguing. Thorogood was fingered in 2 books published in 1994. One was called Painted Black, The Murder of Brian Jones by Jeffrey Giuliano, and Who Killed Christopher Robin by Terry Rawlings. Thorogood either snapped, according to the Rawlings book, or accidentally held Jones underwater for too long in horseplay, according to Giuliano. Anna Wolin stated, quote, "Brian is still portrayed as a bitter, worn-out, depressed man who died because he was drunk, but Brian was a wonderful, charismatic man who was happier than ever, and he looked forward to making more music," unquote. In 2009, the case was reviewed by the police with more information provided by Clarke, but it was officially closed again. A journalist, Scott Jones, told the Sunday Mail in November 2008 that Thorogood killed Jones in a fight. So that's where that earlier bit comes from, holding his head under a trough. He also claimed that senior police officers covered up the true causes of the death. I'm not sure why they would do that. So where does this all leave us? Well, we have Brian Jones, the founding member of the Rolling Stones, so one of the most influential figures in rock history by extension. He dies in 1969, drowning in his pool. He is a known abuser of drugs and alcohol. People who were with him on the day and night of his death claimed that he was in fact murdered by the builder at his estate. There was a deathbed confession from the builder. Okay, my own conclusion? It seems to me, after reading a fair amount about this, that Frank Thurgood had something to do with the death. So how do we interpret the testimony of Jones's girlfriend, that Thurgood may have killed him with just horseplay in the pool? Most likely he and Brian were fooling around, and most likely they were both stoned and drunk, and he held Brian's head underwater for too long, and he didn't mean to kill him, but Brian had bad asthma, an enlarged heart, and a rundown body, and he didn't have the strength to recover. So perhaps Thurgood panicked, he was drunk himself, and didn't realize it until it was too late. In the case of Brian Jones, this being what we would call a British story and not a US-based one, the speculation doesn't lend itself to conspiracy. If this happened in the US, there'd be a media conspiracy. I don't think that's what we have here. You heard the expression, the fog of war. Well, in the 1960s, we really have the fog of drugs. And so with the deaths of some popular rock stars, it could be Brian Jones or Jimi Hendrix or Jim Morrison or Janis Joplin, conspiracies start to fall apart when you realize the amount of drugs that were going around. For our young listeners, it's hard for you to conceive the amount of really bad stuff that these guys did in terms of drugs. It was just a way of life. And often the users didn't know how damaging it was. They were the guinea pigs. And so that contributed too to the death of Brian Jones. Oh, I told you at the beginning of this episode that I would reveal an answer to the question, on which Beatles song did Brian Jones play sax? The answer is You Know My Name. Look up the number. And he just did it off the cuff, no rehearsal. I hope this episode of Serious Rock Talk Crime inspires you to read up on the life and times of Brian Jones, an influential rock figure, a great musician, and yes, the founder of the Rolling Stones. This has been Dr. Ian Clarke for Serious Rock Talk and Masters of Rock Talk. Thank you for listening, and I'd like to thank my pal for riding shotgun today.
Ferris Kennedy wishing you all a good night.